Well, hi, everybody. Hey, there's a step there, by the way. There's another step. Well, I like to be up front so I can see these a little bit better, but obviously they had roadblocks in the way. Yeah, I am here again this year to talk about our new project, UMU. So last year, let me get into a little bit about myself first. My name's Tom Crider. I'm a software maintenance engineer for Red Hat, and that's my day job. But today, I'm here as the creator of Proton-GE, or now renamed GE-Proton for quite a while, and the co-founder of a group called Open Wine Components. We have created a new tool in Linux gaming space called UMU. And I know the name sounds odd. I'll explain it later. It does make sense, I promise. So how it started. Last year, myself and others in the Linux gaming space were invited as a group to Ubuntu Summit. It was just a couple of us. It was myself, a couple of people from Heroic. It's a GUI launcher for games, as well as Lutris. We also had Eric, who was a member of Valve's company, who was with our group. And we started to talk about how Valve launches games using Pressure Vessel. So if you aren't familiar, when Steam runs games on Linux, they use Proton. And Proton is the actual set of tools that runs inside a container which is launched by Pressure Vessel. So that's what I pretty much just talked about there. Valve describes Pressure Vessel basically as a bit like a simplified version of Flatpak for Steam games. It's used by Steam's container runtime, the Steam Linux runtime, compatibility tools to run games in individual game-specific containers. So basically, when you launch a game from Steam using Proton as a compatibility layer, it does this. First, it runs Pressure Vessel. Then after it runs Pressure Vessel, it runs a container. And inside that container is the Steam Linux runtime container image. That container image itself is built off of Debian. And inside the packages are mostly just Debian packages, but a couple of them have been modified by Valve for gaming on Steam. So that runtime is really important because it's also what Proton and all of Proton's components are built on. So when Proton is compiled, it's compiled within that container, within that runtime. So the reason for that is because obviously with everything containerized and being able to both build Proton as well as run games inside that container, you have a solid, steady target for getting things running consistently no matter what system they're on or what distro you're on, because of, again, it's containerized. The reason for Pressure Vessel itself is because it allows certain things from the host to pass through, graphics driver differences, things like that, that may not necessarily be something you can use within the container by itself. This is pretty much what I just told you. Gives a little bit of a more detailed rundown of it. It has the Reaper, which runs the Steam launch command, and the Reaper itself is basically a process monitor, so that it can keep track of PIDs whenever it gets launched. And Steam launch goes into the files for the Steam Linux runtime, and it runs this v2 entry point. The v2 entry point is what we originally target in UMU. And what happens with the v2 entry point is basically Steam feeds it a bunch of options and environment variables that Pressure Vessel needs in order to run properly. So at the bottom here, we see that the verb is one of the things that it feeds to Proton. It launches Proton itself, and then it launches your game, all within that container. And again, the v2 entry point is what we use to target to run Pressure Vessel. This is a little bit of a chart of how that looks, and you could make some differentiations. This is just a very rough chart, so people can get a general idea of what's going on with that whole situation. Obviously, you can see the main containerization happens with the Steam Linux runtime, Proton, and the game. Pressure Vessel is mostly just a big bash script, to put it easily. So yeah. The reason to use Pressure Vessel and the Steam Linux runtime. again, I'm going to hammer down on this. By using this, again, you have a containerized environment. And by using that containerized environment with specifically the Steam Linux runtime, you're able to make games run consistently and have a consistent target no matter what system or OS it's on. I mean, we had, right before the summit, we actually had somebody in our Discord that messaged us that said they were able to use UMU to get OSU running on Ubuntu 14.04, which was really funny. Yeah, I saw that and I was like, okay, that's kind of crazy, but they did it. We didn't intend it for it to go that far back, but you know. For comparison, if you don't understand why the container is important in terms of libraries, when you have different distributions, they're going to have different library versions. So, like, one system might have library SO version 4.5.6. Steam Linux runtime might have version 1.2.3. If Proton is built using Steam Linux runtime 1.2.3, and you run Proton outside of that container, it might have conflicts with version 4.5.6. So again, if you run it inside the container, you get the proper library that Proton needs, and you don't hit those conflicts. A more common library that I can probably use as an example, maybe for other games in the past, would be glibc. That's always been a fun one, especially with anybody that's familiar with Easy Anti-Cheat. That was, glibc broke Easy Anti-Cheat a couple of times. Okay, so we're going to go back to how UMU does allow Pressure Vessel to run outside of Steam. Again, we're targeting the v2 entry point. This entry point is basically a monolithic bash script, and you feed options to it. So what we're doing is we're basically, in that big chart that I showed you before, we're taking Steam and taking that out of the picture, and instead we're replacing it with UMU. And so what UMU does is it'll feed all of these options and environment variables to Pressure Vessel, which then, of course, launches the container, launches Proton, launches your game. And by doing that, we allow UMU as a tool to change those options and to, therefore prepare the prefix the same way that Steam would, or feed different environment variables to it in terms of like non-Steam games. Let's see what else we got on here. Yes, okay, so I've got a couple of points that I just boggled my mind for a minute. When I say launcher, a lot of people think like, oh, well, we already have a Heroic, or we already have a Lutris, or we already have a Bottles. UMU is not a front-end GUI tool. It's a CLI, client. It's a command line interface tool, a command tool. And the reason we went with a command tool is because we wanted it to be able to be used as a back end for these other tools so that we can unify everything. Before, they would use maybe like different versions of Wine or specific different builds of Wine in order to run their games, and they would build those versions of Wine natively on their system. And then, of course, you have different problems per different system because they're not running in a container. Now, with UMU, we've kind of resolved that because everything's running within Pressure Vessel. We've also made it work correctly within a snap as well. It's a dev snap right now. We're working with quite a few people that are involved in the snap environment in order to get that correct. We've also got it working in a Flatpak, as well as within Heroic and Lutris inside the Flatpak. And we are working on getting that upstreamed, as well as we have the CLI tool itself set up, almost ready to be submitted for official Flatpak. And it also works inside of Valve's GameScope session. So if any of you have a Steam Deck or run Bazite or anything like that, you might be familiar with the GameScope session. The GameScope session is when you log into the Steam Deck and you see the nice Steam interface, and you can easily check, move everything over and check with your controller and select whatever you need. That is a GameScope session. It's a full user session running inside GameScope. And GameScope itself requires some specific window management in order to do things properly. In fact, they actually run two sessions that you have to bounce back and forth between for certain windows. So we've got all of that managed within the last year or so, and that is just the launcher side. So UMU is a couple of components, but the launcher part is what we're talking about right now. We'll get into the other parts in a bit here. So what sets UMU apart from just adding a non-Steam game to Steam and running it that way? Let's say you have, I don't know, Red Dead Redemption 2. Let's say you have the non-Steam version on Epic, right? Red Dead Redemption 2 has patches inside of Wine, and inside of Proton's version of Wine, that only trigger with the Steam Game ID. So if you don't have that environment variable set with the Steam Game ID for Steam, those patches inside Wine are not going to trigger if you run it with Proton. So obviously, if you add the game as a non-Steam game and you don't have that environment variable set, it's not going to trigger those fixes and it may not work correctly. And because of that, some people don't know. I mean, a lot of people don't know that those environment variables exist. I mean, most of us, if we're Linux gurus or tinkerers, we're going to figure some things out, but the general public, they're not going to know about that. So what we do in UMU is we have a set of Proton-Fixes. Proton-Fixes was originally part of just Proton-GE and originally just for Steam games. And the way that works is it would see the Steam game ID that was assigned by Steam. It would then go through Proton, and we integrated it as an extension for Proton, for Proton-Fixes, just a little Python script. And when it hits that, it searches for the ID, and then it says, okay, we found this ID, we found a fix for it. Let's go ahead and apply that fix. And so now we can apply that fix to other games. What we did is we decided, let's take that and extend it to UMU, and we're going to have to do that the same way that Steam does. We're going to take any non-Steam games that need fixes, we're going to build a database, and we're going to assign them IDs. So we've now, within the last year, got 1,000-something entries in our UMU-Database for non-Steam games that also apply fixes that usually would apply to Steam games or are fixes that are needed outside of Steam. To give you an idea of what those fixes might be, it's something like if you've ever in the older times run Play on Linux and you went to go install a game, you might be familiar that they have install scripts that they had, which would create the wine prefix, and then it would do a couple of different things inside the wine prefix. Maybe run wine tricks, which did like DLL overrides, or registry edits, or specific tinkers that the game might need. Well, there are still games that still need that stuff. Lutris does the same thing with their install scripts, with a lot of games. So in order to keep that and do that with Steam games, we needed Proton-Fixes. So we did that. And the problem with the original approach, again, was that it was just Steam game IDs. And again, what I said is we extended it outside of Steam. We made our UMU-Database, and we started the UMU-Database and put it all on GitHub. The UMU-Database, the contents itself are just a comma-separated value sheet, a CSV sheet. We've got guidelines on our README for adding content or committing content for games that need fixes, and so that anybody can just read those guidelines and submit an entry to the CSV sheet. That's the easy part. What we also did is we set up a very basic MariaDB or MySQL database, import it, and what we do for that is we import the contents of the sheet into that database. We have a website, simple website front end. It's just written in PHP. It's meant as an example. And you go to the website, it has a search bar. You can search for the game, find the game ID, and then either set it as an environment variable or these launchers like Lutris or Heroic or even Bottles further down the road can query the database. And how do they query the database if it's just a PHP website? Well, it's not just a PHP website. We also created API endpoints for that website to query the database. So they can say, okay, we don't know the ID, but we know the store, we know the title, we maybe have the code name that the store gives us. So like Epic Games, if you own a game and you launch it, within the process manager, you can see what the code name is. So Lutris will see what that code name is, feed that information into the endpoint, and then get back the ID That'll feed it to Proton, and then, well, GE-Proton or UMU-Proton, and that'll trigger the fixes from GE-Proton or UMU-Proton. So we decided to move forward as a group here, and I can't see because of the timer here. So we decided to add entries to this database and Proton-Fixes so that across the board, any games would work with these fixes. There's not, hopefully, not going to be any more, well, this works on Lutris, but it doesn't work on Heroic, or this works in bottles, but it doesn't work on native wine, or it works with wine staging and it's not working with standard wine. Hopefully, you're still, if you run them outside of this, you're still going to hit those differences. But if you're running something that has UMU as a back end, they're all going to be using the same back end, the same build of Proton, the same fixes, the same database. And the goal is to have everybody hitting the same target, or if they hit bugs within it, have the bugs be a little bit more on the same page. So that way, we're not shooting in the dark in terms of trying to fix it. Our database, again, it started at the beginning of last year, or this year, and it's grown to past 1,000 entries. Currently, that's what the database entry will look like from the CSV sheet. On top of that, we've created, again, the basic website that I told you guys about. We've got an example of what it would look like if you search those entries on the database. And obviously, you can see we did a search for Age of Wonders. You get the UMU ID. You get the GOG version or the Humble version. It shows you what Proton fixes are available if it has Proton fixes. One thing about the UMU ID that we did is if it is a non-Steam version that also exists on Steam, we assign it UMU dash and then the Steam ID. And that way it's able to parse the second part of the Steam ID in order to apply those Steam fixes, regardless of whether or not it has an UMU ID assigned. So it'll take that, add it, and set it up as the Steam game ID, and then it triggers all those patches that I told you about and why. Let's see what sheet we're on. Let's see. The website, of course, has all of our API endpoints. We can do, list all of our entries, check on based on store, check based on title, UMU ID, store, code name, all the game values if you need the game values, get the title, UMU ID and store, get all the game values and entries based on UMU ID. Those are the entry points we've set up for right now. If people need more entry points, we can add those. We've also put all of the code for the website and the endpoints on GitHub as well. So for example, if people want to host their own copy of the database, or host their own copy of the website, or host their own endpoints, they have examples of how to do so. Or if they just want to host them directly by themselves in like a little tiny Linode or something like that, they could do that. The whole point of this is to be able to have a way for these different GUI launchers or different tools that exist outside of Steam to be able to pull that game ID and get those fixes, make it easy for them. So the entirety of the website, like I said, it's up there. That's the full website itself. You can go there, and well, that's the database, the GitHub database. We also set up a simple cron job on our database server to basically just import the CSV regularly. There's different ways to do that. That was just the easiest off the top of the head that we did. An example use case. So, good example of using UMU rather than adding a game directly to Steam as a non-Steam game is Star Citizen. Star Citizen, these are a couple of the tasks that are in the install script for Star Citizen in Lutris's install script. As you can see, it will install VC Run 2019. It'll install Arial font, try and set it to Win64 for the architecture, and it does that through Winetricks. And then, of course, you see we have an environment variable. This environment variable isn't needed now, but up until recently it was still needed, and that was a workaround for the anti-cheat. So those things, and of course we also have to disable PowerShell for the launcher itself because the launcher has some problems with PowerShell in Wine. Normally, if you were to just add it to Steam as a non-Steam game, Steam's not going to know about it. The user's not going to know you have to do those things. So how do you do it? Like if you add it and it doesn't run, you're kind of like, well, what do I do now? That's where UMU comes in, and the UMU-Database, and the UMU-Launcher, and the Proton-Fixes that we added, because it will do all of those things for you as soon as you hit the play button. And it'll walk through, this is pretty much what I just explained. It goes through all of the things that you need to do inside that script. And at the bottom is an example of using the CLI tool, the UMU CLI tool. Wine prefix sets up your prefix. Game ID, we use the star citizen ID. Proton path, you can use GE-Proton or leave it blank for UMU-Proton. It'll automatically download the latest version of UMU-Proton if you leave it blank. Or you can put in a full path to whatever specific version of Proton you want. UMU run is the command name itself, and then the game executable. Of course, that's a little bit long because it's doing a bunch of environment variables, and we generally don't expect people to use a bunch of environment variables. We expect them to use the front-end GUI tools like your Lutris or like your Heroic or anything else that might use UMU as a backend. UMU will then create a prefix after you run that command, and it'll do, this is more along the lines of what a Proton fix looks like inside of UMU. It's Python code. It's very short, very simple. Basically, we have a folder with a list of different stores, a folder with stores that are all separate folders, and once it has the game ID, it parses through that list of stores to find what store, what game ID is associated with that store, and then it pulls a fix, something like this. And that is where we do the same thing that a Lutris script would do, or a Play on Linux script, or a Heroic script, things like that. Of course, tools such as Lutris and Heroic may not know the game ID, UMU ID, and again, that's what the API endpoints are for, and this is an example of how you could query one of the endpoints that I showed you before. And once we query it, we see it returned in JSON format, which is UMU ID and then UMU star citizen. Lastly, we understand people may not want to use GE-Proton, or they may not want to use the latest version of Proton. They may want like a more stable approach. And you can use normal Proton with this. You're not going to get the Proton fixes if you use the normal Proton, but you can use normal Proton with this perfectly fine. And then we also have what I've been referring to as UMU-Proton. UMU-Proton is simply a copy of the latest stable version of Proton with UMU compatibility added, and there's maybe like 2 or 3 other patches added for a couple of specific games. That's it. We try to keep it as plain, simple as can be and as stable as the normal one. We don't want to touch too much on that because we know people like their stable versions. How do I use UMU? Well, like I said before, you could use the CLI tool if you really want to use it directly. But right now, Lutris has it built in. If you select a Proton version in Lutris, it will automatically use UMU as the backend. You can choose any Proton version, and Heroic has UMU built as an option. So you don't have to use it currently, but it's there. And again, if you select a Proton version in Heroic and then go to choose use UMU as a Proton runtime, it will select UMU as the backend. So there is also these are a couple of examples of things that use Proton as well. The Decky loader, if you are familiar with Junkbox, it's been in the news recently because of being listed on Steam, then listed off of Steam, but Junkbox also has a Decky loader plugin, that's what it originally was, and they use UMU on the database side. So they're not using our launcher tool, but they are using our database in order to apply fixes. So that would be another thing if you just wanted something that was directly inside Steam and you don't want to worry about going and downloading an extra tool like Lutris or Heroic. Junkbox, as far as I recall, they currently handle Epic games and GOG games, and they have plans for Amazon games too. So if your games fall in those categories, you can use Junkbox, and it will also be able to use that database. If you want to use a CLI tool, we have instructions right there. If you just go to our releases, it's right there in a README on how to use it. You can follow on GitHub for instructions for currently building the snap or Flatpak. Again, we are working on getting those things to an upstreamed release so that you won't have to build them. Right now, like I said, they do work, but you'll have to build them if you want to use them. This is another example of CLI usage. You can use either use the API or the website, find the UMU ID, and optionally, if there's a store, find the search for the store, and then you set up your wine prefix, set your Proton path, set the game ID that you found, UMU run star citizen. And then optionally with the store specified, we have the store in there as well. TOML file configuration. So let's say you're not, again, maybe you're not using Heroic, or maybe you're not using Lutris. In that case, we have also made UMU able to read basic TOML configurations. And here we see an example where it gives you options to set the prefix, set the Proton version, game ID, executable, launch arguments, and a store if you want. And you can simply set up a whole bunch of TOML files if you really want to, or maybe decide to use that as the backend for, or like part of the configurations for a whole nother GUI application that you might be developing. And wine tricks. So you can also use wine tricks with UMU. We have wine tricks built into part of Proton-Fixes. It is kept updated regularly. We have made it so that if you pass any of the options from wine tricks to UMU, it will parse them correctly, use the runtime, and apply those wine tricks inside the runtime the same way that some of you may know what Proton tricks does. It kind of does the same thing, but this actually runs it inside the container, as opposed to, well, Proton tricks will use the prefix, but as far as I recall, it doesn't use it inside the container. Okay, so will you tell me why it's called UMU now? I kind of rushed through this, so I've got a little bit of time left. Will you tell me why it's called UMU now? An UMU is an above-ground oven of hot volcanic stones originating from Polynesian culture. After the stones are heated, the top layer is removed, and the food is placed on the top to heat or cook. So we took that concept, and we said, well, Valve's tool is called pressure vessel. And basically, if you were to take a pressure vessel, say like a pressure cooker, you would put it on a stovetop. So we are basically building our stovetop, which is our UMU. And once we clear the top layer of that stovetop and we put our pressure vessel on top of it, we are preparing pressure vessel. And that is where UMU comes from. That's the end. I am very, very early on time. I kind of planned this to be a little bit longer, but last year I kind of went over time. So if you are interested, stop by the OWC, the Linux gaming booth. Our group is OWC. We aren't a company or anything like that. We're not trying to sell anything. We're not trying to do anything, or we're not trying to give try any product or anything like that. We are just trying to unify a lot of the people in the Linux gaming space that have these tools to kind of do everything the same way, so we're not hitting a bunch of different weird, crazy bugs per this, per that, etc. You can find us on GitHub, Open Wine Components, and that's pretty much it. I guess we've got 20 minutes for questions if anybody has any questions. And again, I do apologize. I know I'm quite a bit early this time. I tried to not go over the time like I did before. Thank you very much. All right, go ahead.
So before my question, I just want to say thank you for the best written Snapcraft YAML and the best written Flatpak YAML I've ever seen.
Thank you. We put a lot of work into those. I appreciate that.
Have you had any interactions with Valve or code weavers related to UMU specifically? I'm wondering if they might be interested in starting to hop on board this and unify.
Well, I am friends with quite a lot of the people from there. We actually have a separate Discord that we all talk in, and I've been associates with them for the last like 5 years or so, ever since I started GE-Proton. They are not involved with this project, and obviously a lot of them are contracted by Valve these days, so it would make sense if it's a conflict of interest or something like that. I understand that. But again, our goal was basically just to allow non-Steam games to run the same way, because we all appreciate what Valve has done, and we really like the way that they made our games just work. So we want to extend that, we want to expand that, and I think they do hopefully appreciate this, even if they're not able to officially condone it. But I haven't heard anything against it yet. I haven't had anybody yell at me, thankfully. So for anybody watching or anybody watching from that Discord, hi, I'm sorry if I offended anyone. All right. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, so this is all great, and you talked a lot about using this to configure Proton wine environments. How well does this work when you're trying to say if you're using just a regular wine staging or a wine environment? Because, like, for example, Fedora, a lot of the stuff that typically ships in Proton is actually already shipped as part of wine staging, which is Fedora's default wine. So, like, can UMU be used to work with the system wine environment to be able to support Windows applications and games through that? We are actually
we are actually planning in the long term of supporting not only separate wine builds or wine staging builds within the container, but also native Linux applications as well. Because at the end of the day, it's a glorified, modified Debian container.
Right.
You can pretty much run whatever you want in it. The other thing, though, is with specific regards to wine or wine staging, I think we would need to build something like Proton, but for applications.
Okay.
A little bit separate away from that, because there are, again, a lot of components related to Proton, and if you're doing standard wine inside the container, even if you're running it in a container, you're probably going to go back to ending up building specific versions of wine that have certain patches, and we kind of want to avoid that.
Sure, right, yeah. The main thing I'm thinking of is like this stuff with UMU is actually really great because games are complicated and horrible and all this other stuff, but there's also productivity applications, there's also, like I have to file taxes and I would like my tax software to work on Linux too, and it don't. So
right.
That's the sort of thing that, like, it'd be interesting to, if we could reuse this kind of architecture for that sort of thing.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. We definitely want to get there. And the other thing is we don't want to step on the toes of existing stuff that already is out there. For example, your Flatpaks and your Snaps, who also try to get that done, but not specific to wine or Windows applications. So I think this could be a very good use case for Windows-specific applications that we want to get going within the same environment. I know CodeWeavers does have their software as well, Crossover, which it's amazing software. If people are not familiar with it, I recommend to check it out. CodeWeavers is fantastic, and their software is great as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would say that's something to check out, but we do plan on also tackling that in the future.
Cool, thanks.
Sure. Anybody else?
So I have a question, because sure. UMU and Proton-GE and Lutris Heroic are great projects, and how one does contribute to UMU without coding knowledge, for example, extending database, what else, basically?
Okay, well, the easiest way, if you have, for example, if you want to fix a game or you know a fix of a game, is to go to the GitHub, the UMU-Database. We have guidelines. Like, you don't have to have coding experience to add an entry to a CSV sheet. Like, it's just a straight-up comma-separated value, right? So let's say you have a game that needs a fix. You submit the CSV entry, and you can submit that, and then we have UMU-Database, and we have UMU-Protonfixes. You can submit that, then go to the UMU-Protonfixes, open up a ticket, and say, hey, I don't know how to code, but I know maybe it needs like a DXGI override or like a direct 8 input override for a DLL. You can say, I know it needs this DLL override. Can you guys add that? And we can totally do that. As soon as we see it, we'll pretty much just say, okay, sure, not a problem. Very, very easy to do that way.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure. Well, anybody else? Any other questions? Gaming related? Probably Diablo 4 currently, yes. I've played a lot of Diablo, and my second favorite would probably be the entire Doom series. I'm a big Doom fan. So yeah, that's what I got. Anybody else? Last minutes? I know we got 15 minutes left. And sorry, I'm a little bit early here.
What about Universal Windows Platform?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Universal Windows Platform. For example, Xbox, Microsoft Store games.
Actually, Heroic is working on getting some games from the Windows Store working, which is kind of wild. They did a lightning talk on that yesterday, which is very, very cool. So hopefully, if that comes to fruition, we can migrate that in as part of UMU, if it works that way. We still have to look into it, but I thought that was very, very cool that they're getting that to work. I think they had the Windows Store version of Minecraft working, which was pretty awesome. Kinda. It launched, at least. All right. Well, if nobody has any other questions, I will go ahead and hand this back over to our guys here. And I appreciate everyone here that has attended, anybody that's been watching. I appreciate you guys. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of Summit.
Can you just wait for me until I'm back on the stage? Sure.